Hello and welcome back to Pics and Portraits. Recently, I saw Peter Jackson's They Shall Not Grow Old, and it got me thinking about film colorization, so much so that I thought I would dedicate a video looking into the history of this process. Now, to be clear, the films and footage we are going to be looking at were shot in black and white that color was then added to, rather than color film. So we're going to be focusing on some of the people and processes responsible for colorization, starting in the 19th century. One of the earliest photographic processes was the Daguerreotype. Introduced in 1839 by Louis Daguerre, this process consisted of exposing treated silver-plated copper to light, then to mercury fumes, producing a monochrome image. Now obviously, this was due to technical limitations rather than an artistic statement. We see in color, and soon processes were invented to replicate living images by hand. The first person to experiment with colorization was Swiss artist Johann Baptist Isering. Isering discovered that color could be added using a mixture of gum and pigments that were applied to the daguerreotype with heat. Vibrant pastel colors were often used to mask the darkness in the black and white images. This is a technique that would carry over to film colorization. Elisabeth Thuillier operated a coloring lab in Paris in the late 1800s. She had specialized in hand coloring photographs and magic lantern slides prior to motion pictures. In 1897, Thuillier began experimenting with the budding medium of film. Her process was to hand-paint individual prints along an assembly line, with each of her team of 200 women responsible for a different frame and tone. Her most well-known client was Georges Méliès, though another early film pioneer, Segundo de Showman, would be introduced to her process through his wife and Thuillier employee Julianne Mathieu. Showman would help develop the next evolution of colorization, Pathécolor. Named and developed for the production company Pathé, this was a stencil-based process similar to rotoscoping, where a print of the film would be projected onto a sheet of glass. The section of the frame that was to be colored could then be traced with a stylus on the glass that was connected to a blade that would cut a corresponding outline in the film itself. The number of these stencils depended on how many colors would be in the film. To complete the process, the final print would be matched with a stencil and run through a machine that applied the dye. Repeat with each color as needed. A similar technique, known as the hand-Schiegel color process, used black paint to mat out areas that were to be colored. A duplicate negative was made from this painted print and developed in a way that hardened the celluloid while leaving the parts that were blacked out soft, allowing dye to be added. Like with Pathécolor, the colored negative prints would be matched with a positive print, and the dye transferred to the desired areas. Again, repeat as necessary. The advent of color film effectively made these processes obsolete. Still, studios saw earning potential in re-releasing their back catalog in color. In the late 1960s, Warner Brothers would colorize their classic cartoons by tracing over the original animation, but to save on labor costs, they only did so with every other frame. As you can see, this impacted the fluidity of the animation and resulted in a jittery, cheaper look. Classic Warner shorts would again be colorized in the early 90s, somewhat more successfully at the behest of Ted Turner. We'll get to him in a minute. However, while the animation remains intact, the digital coloring lacks the warmth of that done by hand. In both these cases, we see that color not only adds nothing to the film, but actually takes away from it. This was one of the early arguments against colorization as the trend grew in popularity, beginning with Hal Roach Studios. Hal Roach Studios operated during the golden age of Hollywood, producing the early films of Laurel and Hardy. By the 1980s, the studio had gone bankrupt, with the company that had acquired its film library carrying its name. In 1983, Hal Roach Studios bought a 50% share in Canadian company Colorization Inc., headed by engineer Wilson Markle. Markle had previously worked with NASA to colorize footage of the Apollo space missions and had developed a computerized coloring system that allowed film colorization with comparative ease. His process consisted of digitizing the films and mapping out the various shades of gray in the image, assigning a color to each using a computer. Once this was set for a scene, the palette was used, frame by frame, following the actor or camera's movements. The software could also determine the luminosity of the image and adjust the colors accordingly. There were also non-technical challenges, the most notable being authenticity, as it is not always obvious what colors were actually used. For historical footage, like that shot during wartime, there are artifacts, uniforms, medals that can be used for reference, but it is much more difficult to determine the color of, say, a sign or wallpaper in a feature film. There would sometimes be promotional material or props from the film, but more often than not, it was up to the technician's discretion. The first film Markle colorized with Hal Roach Studios was 1939's Topper. The film star, Cary Grant, was so impressed with the process, he encouraged director Frank Capra to speak with Markle about colorizing his work. Capra agreed to having It's a Wonderful Life colorized and invested half of the cost, with the agreements that profits would be shared. Though when Markle learned the film was actually in the public domain, Capra's investment was returned and he was cut out of the process entirely. Kind of a dick move. Another champion of colorization was media mogul Ted Turner. Turner began his broadcasting career in 1969 with the purchase of the independent TV station WJRJ in Atlanta. WJRJ would become WTCG and eventually WTBS. To fill the programming schedule, Turner began acquiring the rights to classic films and television shows. As his media empire grew, Turner was able to purchase more lucrative properties, including Hanna-Barbera Productions and the film studio MGM. Though most of the production side of MGM was sold off, Turner retained ownership of its film library. In 1986, Turner announced he would begin colorizing this library as the ad rates for black and white programming were much less than colored. He also perpetuated the belief that young people were uninterested in older films because they were in black and white. Partnering with Color Systems Technology, he colorized and aired several classic films on his networks, including Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and King Kong. Among the films Turner also intended to colorize was Citizen Kane. Filmmakers and critics came out against Turner, claiming what he was doing was vandalizing someone else's creation. He argued that since he owned these films, he had the right to do with them what he wanted. At this time, many directors of the films Turner was colorizing were still alive, and rightfully condemned him, including Orson Welles. Due to this backlash, and probably the cost involved, Turner would eventually abandon colorization in 1994. However, the push against it led to the passing of the National Film Preservation Act of 1988, which prohibits the distribution of a film that has been altered or colorized without being labeled as such, as well as the creation of the National Film Registry. As technology has advanced, colorization processes have become cleaner and, for lack of a better word, more digestible. One company keeping the tradition alive is Legend Films. Founded in 2001, Legend Films has restored and colorized many films in the public domain, including the cult classic Reefer Madness. They also work with copywritten films with the permission of studios or copyright holders. When comparing their colorized versions of It's a Wonderful Life or Night of the Living Dead against Markle's, we see the colors are more dynamic. They bleed less. The depth of the image is retained, whereas with Markle's the process often rendered it two-dimensional. It looked muddy. The lighting and shadows of a scene are also better defined, however it does still appear somewhat unnatural. Profits aside, the philosophy behind colorization is to replicate how we see, and that brings us to They Shall Not Grow Old. In 2015, the Imperial War Museums in 1418 Now commissioned Lord of the Rings director Peter Jackson to produce a documentary for the World War I centenary. Jackson was given access to 600 hours of first-hand interviews from veterans and 100 hours of film shot during the period. In addition to restoring this footage, he chose to have it colorized, as that is how these soldiers experienced it. The First World War had previously been colorized for television and presented in a traditional documentary format. Jackson, on the other hand, uses colorization and the soldiers' narration to create an intimate and immersive experience. As viewers, we are brought into their world, and we see and hear it with as much authenticity as technology can allow. I absolutely love this movie, and cannot recommend it enough. It's incredible to see how far colorization has come, from hand-painting every frame, to programming software capable of doing it within minutes. Though I think colorization is extremely interesting, I do feel it is very much a novelty. I find very little appeal in watching a feature film that has been colorized, though I do believe exciting things can be done with it if used sparingly or stylistically, as in They Shall Not Grow Old. As colorization and restoration often go hand in hand, I hope projects like They Shall Not Grow Old pave the way for preservation of more archival and forgotten footage. I will post links to relevant material in the description below. If you haven't, please subscribe and check out some of our other videos. If you do enjoy what we do and want to support us, do give us a thumbs up, share this video, and consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/picsandportraits. I'm Brian Clark. Thank you so much for watching.